For the second presentation commemorating the Temple City Centennial, we're talking about Walter P. Temple, Temple City's founder, tracing aspects of his life over the course of about 70 years. Walter was born in the community called Mission Vieja, or Old Mission, where the original San Gabriel Mission site had been for just a few years back in the 18th century before it moved to its current spot. And he and his family lived in mostly a Latino neighborhood. There were a few Anglos here and there. They were south of Amani. It was an area that was mostly inhabited by small farmers and ranchers. But the Temples were quite wealthy, and this was because they not only were successful in ranching and farming, but had gotten involved in business in Los Angeles. Walter's father, FPF Temple, who had come to this area in the early 1840s, was a major figure. One historian called him a city maker in Los Angeles. On his mother's side, Antonia Margarita Workman, he had his grandfather, William Workman, who was an investor and partner with FPF Temple in business in Los Angeles. So Walter was born into great affluence, but that was going to change very quickly as the family bank, the Temple and Workman Bank, closed in 1876 due to a financial panic and also mismanagement of the institution, not having enough money in reserves and investing depositors' monies in speculative enterprises that did not pan out. So at the age of 6, Walter is in a family that no longer had the significant wealth that it had possessed just shortly before that. He grew up in that Old Mission community. He went to school locally. This is him probably in his early teen years. He went to a school called La Puente School, which was actually in the Whittier Narrows, later called the Temple School. There's a new Temple School today in South Almani that is kind of the descendant of that. Educated at St. Vincent's College. Now, by college, that meant 9 years old up through the college age. This was located in downtown Los Angeles. Wound up later on morphing into Loyola Marymount University. He then went on to Woodbury Business College, which is now Woodbury University up in Burbank. And so he had a basic high school education with what might be called a junior college component to that, and completed that far in his education. When he was 23, though, he inherited 50 acres of what was called the Temple Homestead in the Whittier Narrows. His mother had passed away and left his property to Walter and his younger brother Charles. But it was a shadow of its former self. The bottom photo shows the two family houses. They actually had a very large adobe structure and a 2-story brick building that existed when the family were flush with money. By the time you get to the late 1800s, it wasn't quite like that. The Temple brothers were leasing the large adobe building out or part of it as a winery, and then operated a social club, which means really a saloon and billiard parlor in that, doing whatever they could to make a living. So the photo on the top left shows the Temple Homestead in its more affluent days, as opposed to what you see on the bottom right. In 1903, Walter married Laura Gonzalez. She was a neighbor who grew up in the Old Mission community. And in fact, when she was a teenager, she wound up working for Walter's brother, Francis, at the Workman Homestead where our museum is. Francis had tuberculosis, so he was frequently absent to try to recover his health. And Laura, at the age of 15, 16, was running the ranch for him. She kept journals and ledgers detailing the work that she was doing. She seemed to have a pretty strong business acumen as a young woman. She also had kind of a secret romance with Walter. They weren't allowed to have this be public. We have some letters in our collection that refer to this. In fact, they were together in the 1880s briefly as teenagers and did not get married until they were well into the 30s at the dawn of the 20th century. By that time in 1903, they were living at that Temple Homestead that I showed earlier. But within several years, Walter, who had been a farmer, a teamster, an insurance agent, he raised walnuts and apples, had a lot of financial struggles, was able to put together a deal to go to the estate of Lucky Baldwin, who had died in 1909, and he's represented by a friend named Milton Kaufman, who was an Almani merchant, and they go to the executor of the Baldwin estate and ask about purchasing a small amount of the land that was owned by Baldwin's estate, but formerly owned by the Temples. And it's just a little distance from where Walter had been residing. He doesn't have the money to pay for it outright, though, so they made a financing arrangement with the Baldwin executor. It wound up being about 60 acres. There was an adobe house on that property, which the family moved into, and that's what the photograph on the left shows, is the family posed next to that building with some friends. On the right are the 4 Temple children. On the adjacent hillside of the Montebello Hills, the very northeast corner, they called this Temple Heights, kind of gave it a grand name, but there didn't seem to be a lot of of opportunity to develop this, although there was a feeling that there was an oil belt from downtown Los Angeles through Whittier and the Pointy Hills and down into Brea in northern Orange County. And so there may have been some thinking that possibly there might be oil in the Montebello Hills. Now, the young boy there with the hat, second from the left, is the eldest of the four children, Thomas Temple II. And young Thomas, at the age of 9, was playing around on those hills with a couple of friends one day in 1914. It was a spring. There had been some rain. And so as the rainwater went down, up to the surface came some water that was turning black and bubbling. And he smelled a rotten egg smell, which of course was natural gas, as well as the petroleum that was there, the crude oil. Standard Oil Company, now Chevron, came out and did some test wells on the Baldwin side. Baldwin's daughters had 800 acres as opposed to Temple's 60. And so they made quite a bit of money from their own oil endeavors out there. But the first Temple oil well came in July 1917, thereabouts. And you can see the photo on the left there of one of the workers returning from a gusher covered with crude oil. The top photograph on the right shows the adobe building that the Temple family were living in at the time, and some of the oil wells on their lease. The road to the right is San Gabriel Boulevard, making its way up towards this area. And another photo at the bottom showing the Temple lease, as it was called, at the Montebello Hills. Here's a great before and after image where the Temple family is posed by that adobe house about 1914. And the daughter doesn't have any shoes on. The kids are wearing basic farming clothes. And you don't see a family with a lot of affluence. Within just 4 or 5 years, though, the situation was completely different. The boys are in military school. The daughter has her shoes on, and they're all just a lot better. The family wound up moving from the oil lease property, first in Monterey Park briefly, and then purchasing a house at the east end of Alhambra. Alhambra was a growing community at the time. It tripled in population during the 1920s, and so Walter not only found this to be good for raising a family, but also for future business investment. A couple of other photos of Walter, his wife, and 2 of the children at their Alhambra residence. That house I just showed you does exist. It's the rectory for a Methodist church, but it's been stuccoed, and you can't really make out the house too clearly from the street any longer. But what I was talking about in terms of investment for Walter Temple was taking his oil money and getting involved in real estate. So with some business partners, he was involved in syndicates to develop 2 Los Angeles commercial structures on Spring Street, which was the financial district of the town at that time, around 8th and 9th Streets. So the Great Republic Life Building and a bank building built on opposite sides of the street were among his projects in downtown Los Angeles. And again, he went there specifically, in my mind, to get close to where his father had been investing and building in the 19th century, just a few blocks to the north. The Werpen and Temple family were also very involved at San Gabriel. They had been long involved with the church in terms of sacraments, weddings, baptisms, funerals, that sort of thing. So Walter decided to purchase an entire block across from the Mission and developed that in the early 1920s. It became known as the Temple Block, so he built 3 structures there and donated the site for the city hall that is still standing there today. In Alhambra, where he was residing, he also became a major investor, built a movie theater first on Main Street. He owned about a block and a half on the north side of Main Street between 3rd and 5th, and built several buildings, including the Edison building, which is shown on the bottom right there. That is still standing at the corner of 3rd and Main. Out in El Monte, he purchased a lot and built a structure that became a movie theater and a post office as well. And again, that's close to where he had grown up. The other side of his investments was oil. So he was hoping to duplicate the success of Montebello if he could. He formed a Walter P. Temple Oil Company. His first endeavors were in Whittier. Did not work out quite as intended, but he had also bought some property in Huntington Beach and was looking to try to drill oil there. So he wound up selling his company and then becoming an investor with a new firm. That's what the West Whittier Oil Company shows there in the letter. And so these were a couple of examples of what he was doing. He had oil wells also in Alaska, in Oklahoma, in Mexico, as well as locally. A couple of other examples here would be Signal Hill near Long Beach, one of the big oil fields at the time. He did have some producers here and there in these various projects, but not enough to really continue the success he had at Montebello, or probably to justify or pay back the investments he had put in initially. The one on the left there was one of his last projects out in Ventura, where he was hoping to find that gusher that could restore him to the wealth that he had enjoyed before. Meanwhile, he also had a strong interest in philanthropy tied to history in many cases. His business partner, Milton Kaufman, business manager, had a brother who died in France during World War I, so Walter Temple built a memorial to Joseph Kaufman that was shown here as the dedication at the oil lease near Montebello. It wound up being moved in 1930 here to Temple City Park. Walter Temple was also very interested in the Mission play, which was a very popular theatrical presentation at San Gabriel for about 20 years. Very pro-Catholic, pro-missionary, does not really present the side of the indigenous people. And so it's not the kind of performance we'd see today, although there was a revisionist version of this play produced a few years ago at San Gabriel Civic Auditorium, shown here, which Temple was the largest cash contributor to, along with Henry E. Huntington. And Milton Kaufman, Temple's business manager, was on the board of the Mission play. There were other things too, but just a couple of examples of what he was doing. With that oil money, Walter Temple also invested very quickly in the purchase of the Workman Homestead, 75 acres that had been retained after the bank failure of the 1870s. The Temple family had owned it until the end of the 1800s, and then there were other financial problems, and the place passed into other hands. In fact, one owner decided that the cemetery that's at the bottom of the photograph there didn't need to be there any longer, so he began to dismantle it. This was in the early part of the 1900s. Walter Temple was living elsewhere, but sued to have that stop, not realizing that a decade later he would buy the ranch himself and be able to go back and renovate and restore a lot of what had been done with the damage of the cemetery. So the article on the left shows Temple's purchase at the end of 1917, and an early aerial photograph. These were new things at the time. This was taken in 1921, showing the workman house, the cemetery, some outbuildings, and walnut trees that Walter Temple had planted as he wanted to develop this as a working ranch and farm. Among the renovations, I mentioned the cemetery and the work that had to be done there. He built a mausoleum that was on the site of a church that I showed earlier in the presentation. So that's the upper right. The workman house was modernized with electricity and plumbing, including solar panels to heat the water for the bathroom. So that was kind of a new thing back in those days. And at the bottom, some of the old wineries from the 1800s that were converted into a dining hall, an auditorium, and a 9-car garage. After the Temple family visited Mexico for an extended period in the summer of 1922, they were inspired on their return to build a new home, which they literally called La Casa Nueva. And that meant bringing up adobe makers from Guadalajara in Jalisco, Mexico, to make adobe bricks in the old traditional fashion. They were sun-dried and then baked in large ovens. This 12,000 square foot mansion took 5 years to construct, and there were a lot of reasons for that, including the death of Laura Temple, a change in architects, but also the financial situation for Walter Temple was worsening during that period of time, so that by the time he finished the house, it was only occupied by them for about 2.5 years. And the problem basically was all of that speculation in oil and real estate involved expenses that were skyrocketing as his revenue was declining. And that meant that the family had to face a reckoning eventually. So by the end of the 1920s, the family fortune was basically wiped out. Walter Temple had tried to take out bonds to support construction of Temple City and other projects he had already in the works, but was not enough to stave off the mounting debt that he had. So by the early 1930s, he basically lost all of his property. He died in 1938 in Los Angeles after having lived for a period of time in Baja California, Ensenada, and Tijuana, as well as San Diego. And when he died, he lived in a small cottage in the backyard of a house owned by his girlfriend's parents in Lincoln Heights. So it was a big change from what he had enjoyed doing most of the 1920s. These photographs are also telling because of the fact that when his wife, Laura Gonzalez, died, it probably had a big change, not just in the family's personal dynamics, but potentially the business side of it too. One of the sons told me at one time that he felt that if his mother had survived, things may have been very different financially. The bottom photo showing where she should have been with her family in 1926. So we'll come back and talk about other aspects of the history, including what was here on Rancho San Francisquito and the Sunny Slope Acres proposed town site, as well as some of the early history of Temple City. So please join us for that.